we have to know how, we know that the words are God's words. We know that they came to us. We know that they came in different languages. We know that they were written at various points in time by various men. But understanding how the Bible came to us is vital for us as we not only rely on it for our faith. The words in the Bible are the words of eternity, the words of relationship with the eternal God, and He brought them to us. But then also, out as we are interacting with our neighbors, with our coworkers, there are objections to the Bible, saying, "Oh, there's mistakes made. There are contradictions. There are, 800 some errors within the Bible." And so, how can you rely on something that's ancient, that is that old? So that is why we are going through this study. It's not studying the words of God necessarily, but studying about the words of God, so that our faith is rooted deep in what we know, what we understand. So last week, we studied the technology of the Bible, what it was written on. At the various points in time, the Bible was written on tablets. We know from the tablets that God gave to Moses, and that Moses then, after he broke the first set, had to carve a second set, and the words of the law were written on that. Coming out of Egypt, they wrote on papyrus, which are reeds that were rolled out and flattened and pressed together to make a writing surface. I looked it up this morning, but the oldest papyrus that we have is from 2600 BC, so it's over 4,500 years old, and it was found in the pyramids of Egypt, and it happened to deal with a work when one of the government officials, as he went up and down Egypt getting materials for building the pyramids. So papyrus was around when Moses was given the command to write these words that God had given him down and keep them. So they were written on scrolls, and the Hebrews kept them with in the tabernacle, along with the Ark of the Covenant, because they were so precious. So the alphabet that they used was probably some sort of Proto-Hebrew alphabet, something from that region. The alphabet that we use today is developed from that. And so it's the roots of what our language today is, what we read, what we understand, came from that. And then the scribes, we talked about the scribes last week, and how the scribes had a process of copying and writing from one scroll to another to make sure that the words were faithfully written down and kept. And if mistakes were made, one of the rules was that scroll can never be used in public worship, that it might be something kept for reference because all the time and effort that was made to make that scroll, write down on that scroll, but it was not to be used in public worship. So one of the issues that we have today is that the original autographs, and I'm going to use some terms today because it's important for us to just get exposure to them. One of them is autograph. What autograph means is not, someone writing their signature on a baseball card. That's one thing. What an autograph is in this term is the actual real author's manuscript that they wrote by hand, that first generation manuscript. And manuscript also is whether it's papyrus or paper, that is written on. It's not typed. It's not using a printing press. That is a manuscript. So that we don't have the autographs today because stuff decays. We live in a fallen world. Decay happens. Beetles happen. They love papyrus. They get into them. But we also have to remember that the words of God, which were written on papyrus scrolls and other formats that were kept with the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle and in the temple, there were two burnings of the temples. There was the first temple that was burned by the Babylonians, and the second temple was burned by the Romans. And we lost a lot of manuscripts due to war and destruction. So thankfully, we have people who have copied copies over the years and been faithful to it. We also have, as one of the issues that we'll be dealing with, is our English translations have words in them. If you look at the the Legacy Standard Bible, the Christian Standard Bible, the ESV, the NIV, they have translations of words that go beyond just a tweaking of the original word in Hebrew or Greek. What it indicates that there's actually a different word that the translators are using because they're using different source manuscripts. So that's something that we're going to talk about today as well, and specifically how we got the Old Testament. And then what is left today? We have copies of copies. We have different codices. A codex is, remember, it's the book form of writing. So this is a codex versus a scroll. And so we have a couple of different codices. One's the Sinaiticus and the other one's the Vaticanus. So, one came from the Sinai region, the other one was stored in the Vatican. Those are two of the oldest manuscripts we have of the Old Testament, the copies beyond what we'll talk about with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So those are the full copies, but then we also have partial scrolls and fragments. So a lot of what we have that came out of the 10th century, so the 900s to the Middle Ages, it's a collection of fragments that have been pieced together, and they have been assembled to create to put back together the full works of the Bible that we have. So, as I talked about, one of the terms that we'll be talking about today is the Masoretic text. We'll dive into this later, but that's that period of the 900s to the Middle Ages. The Masoretes, we'll talk about what they did. But the MT, you'll see this often in the notes of your Bible, especially the study Bibles. In the notes down there or below, it'll say, some sources have this, and the MT says this. The MT is really the base text for the Old Testament that translators use, and then we'll get into the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they fit into that. But then the LXX, that's Roman numerals for 70. Roughly 72 rabbis went through and translated from Hebrew into Greek, and so they call it the LXX or the Septuagint. Again, sept meaning 70, or 7, but Septuagint is the 70. The DSS, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, found within the last 75 years. And then autograph, as I said, is the manuscript in the author's own handwriting. So just be familiar with these. If you see them, it just helps you understand what they are versus some of the other terms. So today, we're going to first start off with textual criticism. Who can tell me, who's not already familiar with textual criticism, when you think about criticism, what first comes to mind? Negative. Yeah. So, anything else? Yeah. And then I have the definition up there. It's exercising or involving careful judgment or judicious evaluation. So, criticism in general, there's a whole field of critically reading the Bible and trying to understand it. So, in the 19th century, the late 19th century, coming out of Germany, there was a lot of critical methods that are rather dubious when it comes to faithful Orthodox Christianity. However, textual criticism, and this is the discipline that seeks to recover the original wording of a book by examining the remaining ancient copies of that book. This did not originate out of that time. So this is something that has been in place for over 2,000 years. And really started off when the librarians at Alexandria started collecting all the various Greek works and putting them together and all the copies of them. And the most important works, what they would do is they would put them into a critical text, meaning what it was the kind of an official form of that text, and then they would write commentaries on those texts. And so this was happening even before Christ, the incarnation of Christ. This was happening at the Library of Alexandria. And then in their commentaries, they would go through and take a look at the various copies of the Greek text that they had and compare them and see, this one had, this has, this passage left out or this spelling of this word, and they would write that in their commentaries. They wouldn't mark up the original document, but they would write that up. So this is something that's a practice that is very important to get to the root of what are the original words that God gave us. And through this process, we have a good understanding of what we have. There's very few spots where we really don't know, and we'll get into one in 1 Samuel 13, talking about Saul's reign. Some of you are familiar with that. But that, where we really don't know what the original word was. But the vast majority of words in the Old Testament we know and have a basis for what they are. So, why do we critically evaluate text? Again, we don't have the original sources, and we have copies of copies. So, we need to understand how the scribes who were in charge of making each copy, what mistakes did they make? And how did those mistakes permeate from one copy to another? Because that's what happens, is that someone assumes that a mistake in the original source was actually supposed to be there and they carry it through. Or did they make intentional changes? And some of them were, and we'll get into this later, some of them were, if you can think of a photocopier, some of them really tried very hard to be that photocopier, but they're human. They make some typographical mistakes that we'll look at. And some were more free. And they were more free not because they're trying to change the meaning of the words, but smooth it out, use better grammar, that kind of thing. We'll get into that. And then just the normal scribal errors that come in as they're making those copies. And then, like I said, there are some intentional changes that are made. The fixing grammatical changes. Then we're talking about another thing to understand is the textual witness. And so, what's a witness in our parlance? Where do we use that the most? Court. What does a witness do? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the textual witness in this case is material evidence for what the original text was. And it can be a copy. It's any copy of Hebrew text, translation of it, or a reference to it in a commentary or a book. So the witnesses we have today are varied. So some of them are Hebrew texts that are truly copies of copies of copies. And some of them are translations of the original Hebrew into, say, Aramaic or Greek or Latin. Those are some of the most important ones. And then some of them we have, the witnesses are commentaries. So people writing in, say, the first century, maybe a Jewish scholar who had access to one of the older versions of the Hebrew Bible, say, copying a verse into that commentary. So we are able to take a look at that and say, oh, that's how that looked to him in his day. We'll compare it with what we have 1,000 years later with the Masoretic text. As we look at Hebrew manuscripts, there are really three eras that we need to look at and understand. So the first is the Masoretic period. Prior to 1947, we did not have anything but the Masoretic text to go with as a basis for the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, how we understand it. So this is the one that came in that Middle Age period, the Middle Ages coming in to modern period as men translated the Bible from the various languages, mostly at first into Latin and then into English and the others. We'll get into that later in later weeks. So the Masoretes were very concerned with how the Jews of that day were losing their ability to read the Old Testament. Specifically, that Hebrew form before the Masoretes got involved was called a consonantal form. It means only used consonants. And some of you may be familiar with this. I have a screen later on that shows the Hebrew alphabet. But what the Masoretes did is they took those consonants and based on how those words were being said in public worship as it was being read in the public forum, they would then add the vowels. And so a dot might be a long E sound, or two dots might be, or a line might be an A sound. So they would add that underneath the words or maybe above it. But they are the ones who came up with the system to be able to transmit what that word sounds like. They recognized that we needed to be able to have that information, and because people weren't sitting under the rabbis and the priests hearing those words being said. And so yeah, the 9th century to the Middle Ages, they put all those together, and there's 35,000 different fragments that have come out of that period that we have. They're collected in various locations. The British Museum is very famous for having huge collections of stuff that they've gathered as they had their empire spread, and so they've collected quite a bit there. There's a lot of, I think that one of the museums in France has one. A collection of these fragments, and so that's how we really understood. And when the translators looked at those the works that were assembled out of the Masoretic period, then they were able to translate those into the modern languages of that day. This is an English version of the consonantal form. So, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. We know that, right? As you're reading that, we know that sentence. But what means that that's an E? Why can't they be a Y? Thy quick brown fox. And quack, right? Brawn, fix. So it's important for us to be able to understand and know the vowels that are associated with those words, because we need to be able to understand the meaning. However, we can kind of understand from the context of this sentence what this is saying, and so we can fill those in our head and say them as we're pronouncing those words. Then there's a silent period. There's not much that has come out of this. In fact, only 16 real significant pieces of whether fragments or scrolls have come out of this particular period. There was not a lot going on. This is the 200s to the 500s, right before the Masoretes were involved. And then the earliest period is the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think a local sheep herder, a goat herder, was throwing rocks, as the legend goes, and threw it into one of the caves in the Qumran area and broke a jar. And so he went in to investigate in around 1947 and found jars full of manuscripts. And as people carefully began to investigate each cave, their treasure trove of documents came out of those caves. And what they found, as they investigated them, that the documents contained every book of the Old Testament except for Esther. And then they also had documents about what life was like in the Qumran areas. The Essenes, they were a sect of Jews who were very concerned about living a holy life. And they were very concerned about transmitting faithfully the words of God. And so there were documents of what their practices were like, what the various rituals were like, as they brought someone who wanted to be an Essene into their community and be a part of it. So it was very strict, but they faithfully kept and stored, and thankfully, this is an extremely dry area, and dryness, humidity is an enemy to any kind of paper. So thankfully, whether it's full scrolls or fragments, it actually has, in this, we found the full scroll of Isaiah, and which is extremely helpful in understanding that. And that's important because that talks about the Messiah, not just because it talks about that, but then also it's a full book. It's the full scroll. It's the full work. And so you can compare what the Masoretes had 1,000 years later, because these were written down between 250 BC and 130 AD. So that spread was a very short time, but it's about 1,000 years before the Masoretes were involved. And what we found is there's very little error, very little difference. Letter changes that are easy to detect that might be a D versus an R. In Hebrew, they look very similar. So there's the little tittle that when Jesus talks about the jots and tittles, and jotted tittle, they will still be around with regard to the law, that not one will disappear. So that's what the tittle is, and that little on the end is the difference between an R and a D. So those little changes, But otherwise, the word that was understood and they were using back around when Jesus was on the earth, 1,000 years later, that same message was faithfully copied and we can understand. And then as copying technology got better, we have more and more reliable sources of those copies. And so we can know that the Bible that we read and understand is the faithful Word of God. And then we have ancient versions. And so this is a little bit academic, I know, but there's different versions that we can also use as source material and that scholars have used as source material. One is the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the Samaritans, remember that there was a rift between the Jews and the Samaritans. They hated each other. And that rift was finally formalized around 200 BC. So what the Samaritans were worshiping up in the north, where not at Jerusalem, and they set up their own the temple and the altars up there. So what they did is they took their Pentateuch, and so the first 5 books of Moses, they took those and they edited them. When they edited them, they added it there's one spot where it talks about setting up the altar in Exodus, and then one of their scribes took a passage from Deuteronomy talking about setting up an altar at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and they inserted that when it's talking about the altar in Exodus. Well, we are very familiar with the wording from the whole of the Pentateuch, what that's supposed to look like, so it's easy to detect that someone did that. But what it means also is that in the 2nd century BC, they have a copy of the Pentateuch that they made on their own, and we can compare that with the Pentateuch that was copied by the Masoretes and learn a lot from the language, how things were spelled, if there's any differences in words. So it is a very, very good source. In the Greek, obviously we talked about the Septuagint earlier, and there's a term, so we had the MT, Masoretic text, so Proto-MT really refers to all that material that the Masoretes were using to make the Masoretic text, but then also the source material that the original, the Essenes were using when they accumulated the Dead Sea Scrolls and wrote them down. So something attests. That's another word that comes out of this textual critical methodology. But the Septuagint, the way the grammar, the translations used, they refer to that Proto-Masoretic text. We can compare the Masoretic text and the Old text and see that they were using a source material that was before the Masoretes were involved in producing that text. So the scribes who translated from Hebrew into Greek were using that Proto-Masoretic text. And then most early Christians, they read the Septuagint because it's in Greek. They didn't have to learn Hebrew, and they assumed, and mostly rightly so, that there weren't any errors, there weren't any differences between that and the original Hebrew text. So when you see the apostles as they wrote the Gospels and the letters, often they will use the Septuagint translation and form of a sentence as they're quoting it, rather than doing a direct translation out of the Hebrew, because a lot of their readers and a lot of the people that they were interacting with from the Jewish community knew that version. And so it's a very faithful version and very, very few errors that come out of that. So, and like I said, and I'll get into later with the scribal copying, those errors don't mean fundamental doctrinal changes. There are no fundamental doctrinal changes that come out of the errors that are in the scribal text and the errors that come out. So the other one worth mentioning is that there's the 3. So if you ever look into the history, you'll see this, especially if any of you have learned Greek or Hebrew and you actually read especially the Hebrew text, the ones that have the critical information underneath is where did this manuscript come from? What are the differences between the source manuscripts that we have? Often they will refer to the three when it comes to the Old Testament. Theodotion, Aquila, and Symmachus they came out of a period around when the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so they kind of bridged that around the time when Jesus was on the earth. They were writing and translating from the Hebrew into Greek. So it's a very important witness for us. I'll use that word again. And then in 405 AD, Jerome, who was a very important Christian scholar, took the Hebrew text and the Greek text and translated that into Latin. So Latin, obviously, the language of Rome, also the language of the Roman Catholic Church. This is before the split, so the church in general was using a lot of Latin, especially in the West, because of the Roman influence. He translated that, the Vulgate. So what does the term vulgar mean? But today it means something that's not, it's very base, right? And the Vulgate means common. So this is the common Latin language, which is an irony because later on when we talk about translating into the English, why Wycliffe and some of the others were martyred for daring to translate from the Latin Vulgate into the common English language, they're translating from the common Latin to the common English, right? So they took this, and over time, the Vulgate became the standard. It was God's words. God's words weren't the original Greek and Hebrew necessarily. The ones that they needed to be preaching from were the Latin words. But this is very important. And it turns out that Jerome himself was also using, because it's 405 and before the 10th century, he was using Proto-Hebrew text as well to create and to translate his works. The Syriac Peshitta is another translation into the Syriac from Syria, the Assyrian region. So neighbors, and so a lot of Jews went into that area as they fled persecutions. And so a lot of, there's a base of Jewish believers who spoke and read Syriac. And so there was an effort to have a Syriac translation. It again was using the source material that was before any of the jots and tittles were added. And then the Aramaic Targums, it's a large grouping of Hebrew translations into Aramaic. So these are very, very faithful copies and translations. And because Aramaic was the language of Babylon, it was the language of that region, it was also, think of it like the difference between maybe Latin and Spanish or Spanish and French, between Aramaic and Hebrew. There's a lot of base letters that they have, so a lot of fundamental commonalities that they have, but obviously someone who knows Latin can maybe understand but not speak Spanish directly because there's some grammatical forms that change and words change over time. But they also use that pre-Masoretic text version. And then the last section before we get into, and we might have some time to do a little exercise. It'll be fun, maybe a little controversial, we'll see. But scribal copying. So, as I mentioned, scribal copying was the method that these scribes were trained under, as we talked about last week. The beginning scribe, as they were, say the freshmen, as they're going through the scribal education process and program, would first then memorize sections of text and have to repeat it verbatim to their instructor. And then the next time that they would be given a little bit more leeway to write things down. And so they went through a very rigorous program to learn how to be a scribe. And so in the conservative methods, they tried to be that photocopier as much as a human can as possible. They wanted to be faithful to the original text, using the original words, trying to make as very few errors as possible. And so there's little things that come out of it, though. So, for instance, the spelling of David's name. This is we considered an error that comes out of this, is that, and really not an error but a difference, is that in the Hebrew, the older versions of the text, or the original versions of the text, had DVD as the consonantal form of his name. Then later on, DVYD has a yod added to it, and doesn't fundamentally change his name or how it's said, how it's pronounced, but later on that comes in play. Where this is interesting is that it shows a difference, that it shows that an older text may not necessarily be the one that reflects the original copy, the original form, the autograph that came out, because the Masoretic text reflects this one, and the Dead Sea Scrolls reflect this one, but the scholars know that this one came later. So just because something is older doesn't necessarily mean it's not copying an error or a difference that has been inserted itself. So that's just one of the artifacts. Also, in Psalm 83:6, in verse A, or part A of that verse, it refers to the tents of Moab, and then the later ones had gods of Moab. What's the difference? It's a transposition of two letters in one Hebrew word that makes the difference between a tent and the gods. And that, again, the Masoretic text actually better preserved that original form of the word, because you can tell from the context that it's talking about the tents and referring to the tents in that psalm, not gods. And then there were poetical poetical punctuation differences. So that's another thing that's a part of the conservative methodology, was that they would add, say, indicators of an end of a stanza or a comma. Their form of a comma would be added in, where the original text just had a space to indicate that there was a difference in stanza lines. So those are considered more conservative. Free copying is intentional, and there's various reasons why someone would be more free. And this isn't free to say that they're changing the text, or they feel like they're inserting their own dogmatic views into the words of God. What it's doing is made to either harmonize with something else, to expand or excerpt something from one area, and if you're expanding on it, also exegeting the text would be, there's one particular verse where it talks about a flood, and that what's been added is, and we can tell that, is that waters covered the earth when it talks about the flood in Genesis. So the original, and it's just to help someone understand what a flood means, because someone in a very dry area may not know what flood means. So someone's trying to be helpful, and that's why they would add that. There would also be rare or unusual words that were used that might be changed to a synonym to better help people understand, so they don't get confused with that. Euphemistic changes. So 2 Samuel 2:8 and 1 Chronicles 8:3 refer to Ishbosheth. If you know Ishbosheth, he was Saul's son, and he was involved in being in the rebellion that he was going to set up as king versus King David. Well, in Samuel, it refers to him as Ishbosheth, but in 1 Chronicles, it refers to him as Eshbaal. And what often happened is that the scribes were very uncomfortable with referring to Baal, because Baal is it's not only the term for just Lord or ruler, but it's also the god, Baal. And that was the one that people would often worship. So as you're reading 2 Samuel, comparing that with 1 Chronicles, you see this with Ishbosheth and Eshbaal, same guy. They would often take Baal and change it to Bosheth. Bosheth means shame. Also in Samuel versus Chronicles, we have Mephibosheth, who is the crippled son of Jonathan that David saved. Well, in Chronicles, you have Meribbaal, the same thing. It's the same person. It's not a difference. It's not an error. It's just that scribes over time had taken and made euphemistic changes to their name to kind of get rid of the Baal influence. As I said, additions were made, explanations of words, and then modernizations of spelling or grammatical forms or pronunciation. That's why someone would freely copy that text. And then can someone please read 1 Samuel 13:1. Alex, you got that?
Yep. So Saul lived for 1 year and then became king, and when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel.
Yeah. Let's stop there. That's fine. So that's what I was talking about. We don't know that period. And so as the codex of the Old Testament that was preserved in the Vatican, they actually just got rid of that because it's confusing. Saul lived for 1 year and then he reigned for 2 years. And you'll see some other translations where they will insert like I think the New Living, which is more trying to faithfully understand and communicate based on other sources how long he reigned. I think they said 40 years or something like that. I don't remember the term off the top of my head. But so they just kind of struck that because it's really confusing as to actually how long he reigned. It's very doubtful that he actually reigned 2 years. And then the last thing we want to talk about, and this is usually when you're talking and having apologetic conversations with somebody, these are the errors that they talk about. It's called careless copying, but it's not to say that they were extremely careless. It means that they made a mistake with as they copied one word for another or another letter. So mistaken letters, and here's the Hebrew alphabet. You see the bet and the kaf, so the B and the K. They look very similar, except that the bet has the little tittle on the end, on the bottom. And then you have this version of kaf and resh, dalet and kaf. If that little tail, that indicates the end of a word. And it'll be interesting to take a Hebrew class if we ever do that. I think that would be fun. But learning what these letters mean, they're very similar. Or the resh, and this was talking about, there's a Hebrew word that is supposed to start with an R, but someone made a little mistake and added just a little bit too much on that top line, and the word came in later copies as starting with a D. So those kinds of things. The samek and the mem, the final form of the word. So this means that this letter is at the end of a word. Like, just look how closely they look, right? So these kinds of things will be it's understandable that there might be a little difference, but as we compare those copies, we can understand, oh no, and from context, this word is supposed to be spelled this way, it's supposed to have this form, that we can detect those errors. Homophony, or homophony, however you say that, substitution of a similar sounding word. Haplography, omission of a letter or word in context, and some of these are very technical. Ditography, I like this one. It's just repeating a word. So if you're ever typing an email, I do this on a regular basis and write something to, and then I get distracted, come back, and I write to again. So it's a double word. We can easily tell what those are. They're not having any impact on the meaning of my sentence. Metathesis, a reversal of two letters. That's what I was talking about with the difference between the tense and the gods. That's metathesis. Fusion is combining two words together that should be separated because they're actually two different words. Or fission, separating one word into two. So those are some of the errors. And then homoioteliuton and homoioarcton. Omission caused by two words or phrases that end similarly or begin similarly. As I don't know having examples of that, and then some other omissions. But again, these do not have any significant impact on the meaning of our text. So, let's see, we have 2 minutes. So 1 Samuel 17:4. This is a fun one, and this is one that that it comes up because we have different copies, very faithful copies of the word of the Old Testament and of Samuel have differences here. So, can someone read 1 Samuel 17:4?
And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span.
Okay. And is there a note at the bottom of your Bible? What's that note?
Hebrew, Septuagint, Dead Sea Scroll, and Josephus say 4.
Right. So 4 cubits in a span versus 6 cubits in a span. So the 3, as we talked about, that was that Greek translation. The Vulgate, the Peshitta, and the Targum agree with the Masoretic text that he was 9 feet 9 inches tall. But one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, which again is using copies of texts that were before the Masoretic text, and some very important Greek texts support that he was 6 foot 9 inches tall. So, can anybody tell me why? Let's assume that maybe the original text was 4 cubits in a span, so 6 foot 9, and some scribe changed that to 9. Maybe he was looking at how Goliath's spear was 6 shekels in weight or something like that. Why would it be 6? Why would it be 6 cubits in a span versus 4 cubits? Why would that change happen? What it would mean if David was fighting somebody who was 9 feet 9 inches tall? He's a giant, so the victory's bigger, more impressive. God's victory over God's enemies is bigger. And then let's reverse it. If the original text was 9 foot 9 inches tall, and the air came in and said he's 6 foot 9 inches tall. Well, as we look at Saul, he's described as being what? Head and shoulders above everybody else. So he's about that. And so if Goliath is 6 foot 9 inches tall and Saul is about that height, what does that say? What's that? Yeah, which he was. The text clearly says that. So God's victory and David conquering Goliath isn't any less spectacular. However, it highlights that Saul was not the protector of his people. So there's a debate. It's not exactly clear. We've chosen one over the other because it was God's victory regardless of how tall Goliath was. But that is one of those scribal errors that's come in that we don't have a good answer to about what was the original one. Again, doesn't change the meaning of the text. So, I'll read this quickly and then we'll close. So, the witnesses provide diverse yet complementary testimony about how the text of our Old Testament came to us. Scribes copying the text conservatively did not contradict the word of scribes copying their sources freely. The presence of both scribal modes exhibits conscious copying that resulted in textual complementarity. These texts, even though one might be free and the other one more conservative, they complemented each other, and we can detect those differences. It's not competition. Thus, the scribe's faithfulness motivated both models that led to the beautiful textual mosaic we now observe. Some scribes were faithful to copy their sources letter by letter, while other scribes updated and modified text in ways that mirrored the community's interpretation of them. So, and these two scribal modes continued until the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem in AD 70. After that event, scribes copied the Hebrew text only in the conservative mode. So all the free copying happened before the destruction of the temple. And then in the Aramaic Targum tradition as well, there was some free copying because of translating into their community's reference. So that hopefully this has been helpful for you. Next week we'll talk about how we got the New Testament, and it's a completely different story because it's more modern. We have access to more copies. But in the meantime, let me pray for us, and we'll close, but I hope that you've been encouraged by this. So, Heavenly Father, again, thank you for your word. Thank you for your superintendence over the words that we have and we read. And we thank you that we can trust them because you are God and you are in control. I pray now that you would prepare our hearts for worship as we worship together and hear and learn your word. In Jesus' name, amen.